Don't bother translating for her, the man said with a careless wave of his hand, his voice smooth but sharp enough to cut through crystal and conversation. She wouldn't understand real Italian anyway. The words didn't echo loudly, but they traveled far, slipping between the clink of silverware and the low hum of $2,000. A plate dinner like something colder than the air conditioning set to a perfect 72 degrees. Heads didn't turn right away, but they registered it, the way people do in rooms where power is currency and silence is etiquette. At the center of it all stood Amara Brooks, her black uniform pressed, her posture straight, her presence quiet enough to disappear if you weren't looking for her, which most of them weren't. She moved between tables with the practiced grace of someone who knew how to exist without interrupting, refilling glasses before they were empty, adjusting plates before they were noticed, her steps soft against polished marble that reflected chandeliers like frozen waterfalls above. From the outside, she was exactly what they expected, a shy black waitress in a room designed for men who measured worth in billions and influence in whispers. But inside, something shifted the moment she heard the word Italian. She didn't react. Not yet. Her hand remained steady as she poured a glass of Barolo, the deep red catching the light like liquid velvet. But her eyes, just for a fraction of a second, lifted. Across the table sat Ethan Caldwell, the man who owned the room without ever raising his voice, his tailored navy suit fitting like it had been engineered rather than stitched, his expression calm, controlled, practiced. Beside him, slightly removed yet unmistakably central, was his father, Vincenzo Romano, a man whose presence didn't demand attention, it commanded it. Older, sharper, his silver hair combed back with deliberate precision, his gaze scanning the room not for approval, but for truth, the kind that couldn't be bought or rehearsed. This dinner wasn't just a celebration. It was a negotiation dressed in elegance, a merging of old-world legacy and new-world power, and every detail had been curated to impress one man. The Sicilian father who still believed that respect was something you earned, not something you inherited. The guests leaned in, conversations folding into each other, laughter rising and falling in controlled waves, but beneath it all was tension, subtle and constant, like a violin string, pulled just a little too tight. Amara knew that tension. She had felt it in rooms like this before, where people spoke about others as if they weren't there, where assumptions moved faster than introductions, where being overlooked was both a shield and a sentence. She placed the glass gently in front of Vincenzo, her fingers careful not to touch the rim, her movements precise, almost invisible. "Your wine, sir," she said softly, her voice neutral, professional, expected. Vincenzo glanced at her, just briefly, a flicker of acknowledgement that most would have missed, but Ethan didn't look at her at all. He was too busy finishing his thought, too confident in the rhythm of the evening, too certain of how things were supposed to go. "We like to keep things refined here," Ethan added with a faint smile, as if smoothing over the earlier comment without actually correcting it, his tone polished, practiced, safe. A few guests chuckled, the kind of laughter that agreed without committing, that supported without questioning. Amara stepped back, her hands folding lightly in front of her, her gaze lowered again, her role perfectly intact. But inside, something had already changed, because she had understood every word. Not just the English, not just the tone, but the assumption beneath it. And for the first time that night, silence wasn't just something she carried. It was something she was choosing. The room did not shift all at once. It tilted slowly, almost imperceptibly, like something beneath the surface had begun to move and no one had decided yet whether to notice it. Conversations resumed, but not with the same ease, not with the same careless rhythm, because somewhere in the back of their minds, that earlier comment still lingered, hanging in the air like a question no one wanted to ask out loud. Amara continued her route, step by step, table by table, her movements measured, controlled, as if the floor itself were guiding her, but her awareness had sharpened. Every word, every accent, every subtle shift in tone became clearer now, like a frequency she had tuned into long ago and never quite left. At the center table, Ethan leaned slightly toward his father, his voice lowering into that polished confidence that had built companies and closed deals across continents. "We have made sure everything tonight reflects authenticity," he said, gesturing lightly toward the menu. The wine, the imported details flown in from overseas. Nothing here is imitation. Vincenzo did not respond immediately. He lifted his glass, studied the color, inhaled the aroma, his expression unreadable, but there was something in the stillness that suggested he was listening to more than just his son. Authenticity, he repeated slowly, his accent thicker, heavier, each syllable carrying weight, is not something you arrange on a table. The words settled differently than Ethan expected. A few guests shifted in their seats, smiles tightening, eyes flickering between father and son as if watching a quiet test unfold. Ethan's smile remained, but it thinned slightly, just enough to reveal that control was being maintained, not felt. Of course, he said, adjusting his cuff with a small, precise movement. That is why we pay attention to every detail. Vincenzo nodded once, but his gaze drifted, not across the table, not toward the guests, but past them, landing briefly on the figure standing just outside the circle of conversation. Amara did not look up, but she felt it, the weight of attention, the difference between being glanced at and being seen. It lasted only a second, maybe less, before he turned back, but something had already registered. Then tell me, Vincenzo continued, his tone calm, almost conversational. What do you call this? He lifted the menu slightly, reading a line under his breath, the Italian phrasing polished, correct, but softened for international ears. Ethan answered quickly, smoothly, explaining the regional inspiration, the curated translation, the effort to make it accessible, his voice steady, practiced, convincing. It was the kind of answer that worked in boardrooms, the kind that impressed investors, the kind that usually ended conversations before they began. But Vincenzo did not nod this time. He simply placed the menu back down, his fingers resting on the edge, his gaze thoughtful, distant. Around them, the room continued, waiters moving, glasses clinking, low laughter returning in careful waves, but something beneath it had shifted, subtle but undeniable. Amara stepped forward again, reaching to adjust a plate that had been nudged slightly out of place, her movements as precise as before, her expression neutral, her presence quiet. Excuse me, Ethan said without looking at her, his tone casual, almost absent. Make sure my father is comfortable. It was not a request. It was an expectation, delivered with the same confidence as everything else he controlled. Amara inclined her head slightly. Of course, sir, she replied, her voice soft, measured, unchanged. But as she turned slightly toward Vincenzo, as the distance between them narrowed by just a few inches, something in the air tightened again, not with tension this time, but with anticipation, the kind that builds before a moment no one has planned for, but everyone will remember. For a brief moment, nothing happened, and that was the moment that mattered most, because silence, when it lingers too long in a room like this, begins to ask questions no one is prepared to answer. Amara stepped closer to the table, her movements still composed, still careful, but no longer automatic. There was intention now, something deliberate beneath the surface, something that did not belong to routine. Vincenzo watched her, not with curiosity, but with recognition, as if he were searching for something he had not expected to find in a place like this. Are you comfortable, sir? Amara asked, her voice soft, her tone respectful, the same words any server might use, the same script repeated 100 times a night in rooms just like this. But this time, something shifted before the words even finished leaving her mouth. Because the question did not end in English. It did not transition into the polished, textbook Italian that filled menus and marketing campaigns. Instead, it bent, subtly, almost invisibly, into something older, something heavier, something that did not belong to translation. Si se ne so agio, signori? The dialect landed differently. It did not float. It settled. Thick, grounded, unmistakable. Not the Italian of cities, but the Sicilian of kitchens, of grandmothers, of stories told without writing. The kind of language that was not taught, only lived. For a second, no one reacted, because most of them did not understand what they had just heard. To them, it was simply another foreign phrase, another elegant addition to an already curated experience. But Vincenzo understood. And the moment he did, everything changed. His hand, which had been resting lightly on the table, stilled completely. His eyes lifted, not slowly, not dramatically, but directly, locking onto Amara with a precision that cut through every other distraction in the room. There was no confusion in his expression, only certainty. "Chi ti insigna pararia kasai?" he asked quietly, his voice lower now, no longer performing for the table, no longer part of the evening script. The question did not need translation. It carried its own gravity. Around them, the room continued for half a heartbeat longer, conversations overlapping, glasses clinking, until one by one, those sounds began to fade, not because anyone had asked for silence, but because attention had shifted without permission. Ethan paused mid-motion, his glass hovering just inches from the table, his expression tightening in a way that did not match the calm he was used to maintaining. He did not understand the words, but he understood the reaction. And in a room where he controlled everything, reaction was the one variable he could not predict. Amara did not rush to answer. She did not apologize, did not explain, did not step back into invisibility. She simply met Vincenzo's gaze, steady, calm, unshaken. When she spoke again, it was in the same dialect, the same rhythm, the same unpolished authenticity that could not be rehearsed. "Me na," she said softly, her voice carrying something deeper now, something rooted, something real. "My grandmother." The words were simple, but they did not feel small. They carried memory. They carried history. They carried a world that did not exist in contracts or curated menus. Vincenzo leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing just enough to study her more closely, not with suspicion, but with something closer to respect. Around them, the room had gone still in a way no one could pretend not to notice anymore. Because even those who did not understand the language understood the shift. Understood that something had just happened that did not belong to performance. Understood that for the first time that night, the most important voice in the room did not come from the head of the table. It came from the one person no one had thought to listen to. The silence did not break. It deepened, stretching across the room like a held breath no one dared to release. Because what had just been spoken was not meant for display, not meant for rooms like this, and yet it had landed with more weight than any deal being discussed that night. Vincenzo's gaze remained fixed on Amara, not blinking, not wavering, as if he were measuring something far beyond her words, something that could not be rehearsed or replicated. "Tuana diuni?" he asked, his voice quieter now, but sharper. Each syllable carrying the cadence of a place most people in that room had only ever seen on postcards or investment portfolios. The question was not casual. It was precise. It was a test. Around them, the guests shifted subtly, confusion spreading in quiet glances, because they could feel the gravity of the exchange without understanding the language itself. Ethan's jaw tightened just slightly, the first visible crack in a composure built over years of control, because this was no longer a conversation he could guide, no longer a narrative he could shape. He leaned forward just enough to insert himself back into the moment. "She is one of the staff," he said smoothly, his tone polite but firm, as if gently correcting the direction of attention. "If there is anything you need, I can have it arranged." It was a familiar move, redirecting, containing, restoring order. But Vincenzo did not look at him. Not this time. His attention stayed exactly where it had been since the moment the dialect entered the room. Amara did not rush her answer. She did not look at Ethan. She did not look at the other guests who were now watching more openly, curiosity replacing indifference. She looked only at Vincenzo, her expression calm, her voice steady when she spoke again. "Da vicino a Palermo," she said softly, the words carrying not just location, but memory, the kind that lived in kitchens filled with slow-cooked meals and voices that did not need to raise themselves to be heard. "Near Palermo." Vincenzo's fingers tapped once against the table, a small, almost unconscious movement, but it carried meaning. His eyes softened, just slightly, as if something distant had come into focus. "Quali straightai?" he asked, his tone shifting again, deeper now, more personal, asking not just where, but who, what roots, what story. The room, once filled with controlled elegance, now felt like it was standing on the edge of something unscripted, something that did not belong to curated experiences or carefully managed impressions. Ethan exhaled slowly, setting his glass down with deliberate care, the faint sound of crystal against wood louder than it should have been. He glanced briefly at the others, searching for alignment, for shared understanding, but found none. Because this was not about them anymore. This was not even about him. Amara's hands rested lightly in front of her, no longer moving, no longer adjusting, because for the first time that night, she was not serving the room. She was standing in it. Mia Nana Asai, Kayamava Rosa Marino, she said, her voice still gentle, but now carrying something unmistakable, something rooted in identity rather than role. Vincenzo's breath caught, not dramatically, not visibly to most, but enough that those closest to him noticed the shift. The name did not pass through him like a stranger. It stayed. It connected. The space between them changed in an instant, no longer defined by distance or status, but by something older, something that could not be measured in dollars or influence. Around the table, no one spoke. No one moved. Because even without understanding the words, they understood the moment. Understood that something real had just entered a room built on appearances. And for the first time that night, the balance of power was no longer where they expected it to be. Vincenzo did not move right away, and that stillness carried more authority than any raised voice ever could, because it was not hesitation, it was recognition unfolding in real time, piece by piece, as if a memory long buried had just been called back without warning. His fingers, which had rested calmly on the edge of the table, curled slightly inward, not in tension, but in thought, as his eyes remained locked on Amara with a depth that no one else in the room could fully understand. Rosa Marino, he repeated slowly, the name no longer a question, but something closer to confirmation, his accent thickening, as if the past itself had stepped into his voice. Around them, the air shifted again, but this time it was heavier, more grounded, as if the room itself understood that this was no longer a performance, no longer part of the evening's design. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the subtle movement controlled, but deliberate, his gaze moving between his father and Amara, searching for something familiar, something he could reassert control over, but finding none. Because this was not a negotiation. This was not a business language he could translate into strategy. This was something else entirely. Is there a connection? One of the guests asked quietly, unable to contain the curiosity that had been building, his voice cautious, as if stepping into a space he did not fully understand. But Vincenzo did not answer him. He did not acknowledge the question at all. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, just enough to close the distance between himself and Amara, his presence no longer distant, no longer reserved for observation. Tuanana. Aviana Soru, he asked, his voice lower now, more personal, each word carefully placed, as if he were tracing a line through time that only he could see. Did your grandmother have a sister? The question lingered, quiet but powerful, and for the first time since she had spoken, Amara's expression shifted, not in fear, not in uncertainty, but in recognition of what the question meant, of where it was leading. She took a small breath, steadying herself, not because she was unsure, but because she understood that this moment carried more weight than anything that had come before it. See, she answered softly, her voice unwavering. S.I. Kayamava Lucia. Yes, her name was Lucia. Vincenzo closed his eyes for just a fraction of a second, and when he opened them again, they no longer held distance. They held memory. A faint exhale left him, not dramatic, not visible to most, but enough to shift the entire tone of the room. Lucia era mia madre, he said quietly, the words landing with a gravity that did not need volume to be heard. Lucia was my mother. The effect was immediate, though no one spoke. The room did not erupt. It did not react loudly. It simply stopped, every movement, every whispered conversation, every subtle exchange of glances freezing in place as the meaning settled in, even for those who did not understand the language. Because they understood enough. They understood the way Vincenzo was now looking at Amara, not as staff, not as background, but as something else entirely, something that did not belong to hierarchy or expectation. Ethan's composure faltered, just slightly, his eyes narrowing as he processed what had just been revealed, the structure of the evening shifting in ways he had not planned, could not predict. Amara remained still, her posture unchanged, her voice quiet, but her presence no longer invisible, no longer something that could be dismissed or overlooked. Because in a room built on power, something older had just taken its place. Not louder, not stronger, but undeniable. The words did not echo, but they settled into the room with a weight that pressed against every polished surface, every carefully arranged detail, as if the truth itself had quietly taken a seat at the table and refused to be ignored. No one spoke, not because they were told to be silent, but because silence had become the only appropriate response. Vincenzo did not look away from Amara, not even for a second, as if doing so would break something fragile that had just been restored after years of absence. "Allora, siamo famiglia," he said slowly, the words carrying a softness that had not existed in his voice before, not during the dinner, not even when he had first arrived. "Then we are family." It was not a declaration meant to impress. It was not spoken for the room. It was spoken for her. And that difference was everything. Amara did not step forward. She did not react with surprise or emotion that could be easily read. Instead, she stood exactly where she had been, her posture steady, her expression composed, but her eyes, just for a moment, reflected something deeper, something that had been quiet for a long time and was now being seen. "My grandmother used to say that family is not about who sits at your table," she replied softly, her English returning, but her voice still carrying the rhythm of something older. "It is about who remembers your name when no one else does." The words were simple, but they shifted the air again, because now the room understood. Not the language from before, but the meaning now, clear and direct, impossible to misunderstand. Ethan exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening slightly around the stem of his glass before releasing it, placing it down with care that bordered on restraint. This was no longer a moment he could control. It was no longer something he could frame or manage or redirect. And for the first time that night, he did not try. "You never mentioned this," he said, his voice quieter now, not directed at Amara, but at his father, as if searching for footing in a conversation that had shifted beyond him. Vincenzo did not look at him immediately. His gaze remained on Amara, thoughtful, steady, as if he were still piecing together something that mattered more than explanation. "Because I did not know," he answered simply, his tone free of defensiveness, free of the authority that had defined him earlier. It was just truth. Around them, the guests no longer pretended to resume their conversations. They watched openly now, curiosity replaced by something closer to respect, because even without understanding every detail, they understood the shift in power, the quiet redefinition of who mattered in this space. Amara moved then, but not to retreat, not to disappear back into the rhythm of service. She reached for the wine bottle, refilling Vincenzo's glass with the same precision as before, but now the gesture carried something different. It was no longer just service. It was acknowledgement. Vincenzo accepted it with a slight nod, his eyes never leaving her face, as if memorizing it, as if anchoring this moment in something permanent. "You speak like her," he said quietly, almost to himself, but loud enough to be heard. "Not just the words. The way you pause. The way you choose them." Amara allowed the faintest hint of a smile, not for the room, not even for him, but for the memory that had just been named. "She taught me that language is not about sounding correct," she replied gently. "It is about being understood by the right people." And in that moment, the room understood something it had not been designed to understand. That power, no matter how carefully constructed, could be interrupted, not by force, not by status, but by truth, spoken in a voice no one had thought to listen to until it was too late to ignore. The shift did not reverse. It settled, grounding itself deeper into the room with every passing second, until even the most indifferent guest could no longer pretend that this was just another elegant dinner with predictable outcomes and rehearsed conversations. Something real had entered, and reality had a way of rearranging everything without asking permission. Ethan sat back slightly, his posture still composed, but no longer effortless, his control now something he maintained rather than embodied. He looked at Amara again, this time not past her, not through her, but at her, as if trying to reconcile the person he had overlooked with the presence now standing just a few feet away from him. It was not discomfort that crossed his face, not exactly, but something closer to recalibration, the quiet recognition that the hierarchy he had relied on all evening was no longer stable. "You have been here the entire time," he said, his voice measured, but no longer detached. "And yet this is the first moment anyone has actually heard you." It was not an accusation. It was an observation, one that carried more weight than he intended. Amara met his gaze briefly, not challenging, not submissive, simply present. People hear what they expect to hear, she replied calmly, her tone even, her words landing with a clarity that did not need emphasis. And sometimes silence fits their expectations better than truth. Around them, a few guests shifted in their seats, the statement resonating in ways that made them suddenly aware of their own earlier assumptions, their own quiet complicity in a room that had been designed to favor certain voices over others. Vincenzo watched the exchange closely, his expression no longer distant, no longer reserved, but engaged, as if he were witnessing not just a conversation, but a correction, something long overdue finding its place. "And you chose silence," he said to Amara, his voice thoughtful, not questioning, but understanding. Amara nodded slightly, her hands still resting lightly in front of her, her posture unchanged. "Until it was necessary," she answered. The simplicity of the statement carried more authority than any raised voice could have. Ethan glanced down at the table, his fingers tracing the edge of his glass for just a moment before he looked back up, his usual certainty replaced by something quieter, something more deliberate. "Necessary," he repeated, as if testing the word, as if realizing that necessity had shifted without his approval. The room remained still, not frozen in shock anymore, but attentive, as if everyone present had subconsciously agreed that whatever came next mattered more than anything that had been planned. Vincenzo leaned back slightly, his gaze moving briefly across the table, taking in the faces that had once held authority in this space, now reduced to observers of something they could not control. "There are two kinds of power," he said slowly, his voice steady, carrying easily without force, "the kind that fills a room, and the kind that changes it." He paused, just long enough for the distinction to settle, for the meaning to reach even those who had not been following every word. Then his eyes returned to Amara. "Tonight, you did not fill this room," he continued, his tone calm, but certain. "You changed it." No one spoke after that, because there was nothing left to add, nothing left to correct, nothing left to reclaim. The room, once owned, had been rewritten. Not loudly, not forcefully, but completely. The room did not return to what it had been, and that was the quiet truth no one could ignore, because once something real disrupts a carefully constructed illusion, it does not politely step back into place. It stays, it lingers, it rewrites the space around it. Conversations attempted to resume, but they came back softer, slower, as if each word now had to pass through a filter of awareness that had not existed before. The laughter that followed was no longer effortless. It was measured, considered, and that difference was enough. Ethan adjusted slightly in his chair, his movements controlled, but no longer invisible, his presence now part of the moment rather than above it. He looked at Amaro again, longer this time, not searching for a mistake, not waiting for the moment to pass, but acknowledging what had already happened. "You have changed the tone of this evening," he said, his voice calm, but stripped of its earlier certainty, as if he were choosing his words more carefully now, aware that they carried weight in a different way. Amara did not respond immediately. She did not step forward or retreat. She remained exactly where she was, grounded, present, her silence no longer mistaken for absence, but understood as intention. "The tone was always there," she replied softly, her voice steady, her words precise. It just was not being heard. The statement did not challenge him. It did not accuse, but it revealed something he could not dismiss. Around the table, a few guests exchanged brief glances, the kind that carried unspoken agreement, the kind that admitted, quietly, that they had seen it too, even if they had chosen not to acknowledge it before. Vincenzo rested his hands together, his posture relaxed now, but his attention still focused, still deliberate. He looked across the table, not with authority, but with clarity, as if the purpose of the evening had shifted in a way that no longer required performance. "In my country," he said slowly, his voice carrying that same grounded weight, "we say that respect is not given by position. It is revealed by behavior." The words settled gently, but firmly, touching each person in the room differently, depending on what they had brought with them into that space. Ethan nodded once, a small, controlled gesture, but meaningful in its restraint, as if he were accepting something without needing to defend himself against it. "Then tonight has revealed more than I expected," he admitted, his tone even, but honest in a way that had not been present before. He turned slightly toward Amara, not as an employer addressing staff, but as a person recognizing another presence in the room. "And perhaps more than I deserved to overlook." It was not an apology, not directly, but it carried the shape of one, subtle and deliberate, fitting the moment without trying to control it. Amara inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the words without elevating them, without shifting her own position. "Awareness is not something anyone deserves or does not deserve," she said quietly, her voice calm. "It is something that arrives when it is finally allowed." The room absorbed that in silence, not uncomfortable, but reflective, as if each person present was now navigating their own quiet recalibration. Vincenzo smiled faintly, not broadly, not for effect, but with the kind of approval that did not need to be announced. "You speak with more than knowledge," he said to Amara, his tone warm, but measured. "You speak with memory." "And memory," he added, his eyes briefly scanning the room before returning to her, "is something no amount of wealth can purchase." No one argued. No one disagreed. Because in that moment, it was clear that the most valuable thing in the room was not on the table, not in the contracts being discussed, not in the titles held by those seated. It was standing quietly beside them, having already changed everything without ever needing to raise her voice. The evening did not end with applause or declarations or anything that could be neatly summarized into a moment of closure, because what had happened was not a performance with a final act. It was a shift, quiet but permanent, the kind that continues long after the lights dim and the room empties. The plates were cleared, the glasses refilled, the subtle rhythm of service returning, but it no longer felt the same, because now every movement carried awareness, every glance carried memory. Amara moved through the room once more, her steps just as steady, her posture just as composed, but the space around her had changed. People noticed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the way their eyes followed her just a second longer, in the way their voices softened when she approached, in the way respect, once absent, now appeared without being asked for. Ethan remained seated for a moment longer than the others, his gaze resting on the table, not out of habit, but out of thought, as if recalculating something that numbers could not define. When he finally stood, it was not with the same effortless command he had entered with, but with something more measured, more aware. He turned toward Amara, who had just finished adjusting a place setting nearby, and for the first time that night, there was no distance in how he addressed her. "Thank you," he said simply, the words unadorned, free of performance, carrying a sincerity that did not need to be emphasized. Amara met his gaze briefly, her expression calm, her presence unchanged. "You are welcome," she replied, her tone even, not elevated by the moment, not diminished by it, but grounded in exactly what it was. Vincenzo rose as well, slower, deliberate, his movements carrying the quiet authority that had never needed to announce itself. He stepped closer to Amara, not as a guest acknowledging staff, but as someone recognizing something personal, something that had crossed time and distance to stand in front of him. He placed his hand lightly over his heart, a gesture simple, but full of meaning. "You reminded me of something I thought this world had forgotten," he said, his voice steady, his eyes warm. "That where we come from does not disappear just because others do not see it." Amara held his gaze, her expression softening just enough to reflect the weight of that recognition. "It does not disappear," she said quietly. "It just waits for the right moment to be heard." Around them, the room began to empty, the evening dissolving into quiet conversations and departing footsteps, but the atmosphere remained altered, as if the walls themselves had absorbed what had happened and would not let it go. Ethan glanced once more at Amara before turning toward the exit, his expression thoughtful, no longer defined by certainty, but by something more open, something willing to change. Vincenzo lingered a moment longer, offering Amara a final nod, one that carried respect not given lightly, before following his son. And when the doors finally closed, behind them, when the last echoes of the evening faded into the quiet hum of the city beyond the glass, Amara remained where she was for just a second longer, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her breath steady, her presence calm. She had not raised her voice. She had not demanded attention. She had simply spoken when it mattered. And in doing so, she had changed a room that once believed it could not be changed. Because power can fill a space, but truth, spoken at the right moment, can redefine it entirely.